When people say blockchain is a distributed ledger, what do they even mean by that? This video is a non-technical explanation. Let me start by showing you the classic image that people associate with distributed ledgers, and I'll give a basic definition as well. But after that, I'd like to tell you a story about the Gossip Notebook Society, because that'll help us bring to life this concept of a distributed ledger and think through some of its properties. So first, people like to explain the distributed ledger by contrasting these two images. The image on the left shows a centralized setup where there is a central node, which can be a person or a group. And this centralized node heads the whole group by sending messages down a level of command. And you can easily reorganize this image into a pyramid. This is like a corporation with a C-suite leadership at the very top that makes decisions centrally, and then those decisions trickle down. And oftentimes those kinds of organizations try to empower people on the lower nodes by giving everyone the opportunity to propose a change, but that change always needs to go through the central player before it's implemented. If you wanted to hijack control over this organization, all you would need to do is to infiltrate the higher-ups, and then you can take over the entire system. The image on the right, on the other hand, shows a network of nodes that are all interconnected. And none of these nodes particularly have more power or influence than the others. The power, therefore, is more distributed. Also, if someone were to try to attack and take this over, it's much harder. Imagine an attacker trying to infiltrate a given node. Corrupting that one node is not going to change the stability of the overall system that much. And infiltrating thousands of independent nodes, that's even more difficult. That's the classic explanation, but I'm convinced that we as humans think about things more clearly and more flexibly when we use more visual analogies and stories. So I'm going to explain things using an early 19th century English town, Jane Austenville. But as I tell it, I'm going to leave it up to you to make the parallels to the modern day world. And I might title this Elizabeth Bennet's Gossip Notebook Society, or I might title it Elizabeth Bennet Invents the Distributed Ledger. Now, one thing you should know about Miss Bennet's town, Austenville, is that there are factories there, and the workers in those factories have pretty poor working conditions and really low pay. And occasionally those workers whisper among themselves that they should all come together to negotiate against the owners of the factories for better pay and better conditions. But here's the problem. This isn't going to work unless all the workers across the different factories all come together. And this town is fairly large for its day, so that's hard to organize. Also, the families that own the factories have a lot of money and influence in town. So when they catch wind that there's going to be a union organizing, they pull strings. They send out misinformation about the day and the time of the meeting. They threaten anyone who's talking about the meeting. It's not pretty. So the union thing never got off the ground in this town. Now, Elizabeth Bennet is an observer of society, so she knows what's going on with the factory workers, even though she herself is more in the upper crust. Now, there are some things about this town that are common to the upper crust and the factory workers alike. This town is very social, and there's groups of young people in the town who like to get together and put on a play like a Shakespeare play for their neighbors, and of course they love dancing and they love country balls. The problem is that so many of these social things happen on the spur of the moment, and the word doesn't always get around to everybody in town, in which case people get offended that they weren't invited. When really they would have been invited, it's just that the word didn't get to them on time, and then there's a lot of hard feelings because of that. Well, the town clergyman came up with a solution to this, which is the equivalent of a modern-day calling tree. Really, it's the same thing, except calling on someone meant making 15-minute visits to their house rather than using the telephone, since that hadn't been invented yet. Here is the calling tree that the clergyman wrote up one day. If someone was planning to put on a play or throw a ball, they could just go to the parsonage, the clergyman's house, and the clergyman and his wife would each go out to 5 different people and tell them in person about the ball. And those 5 people would each visit 5 more people, and so on and so forth according to his list. And this way, the word could spread in an organized and ideally consistent way so that nobody would get left out and nobody's feelings would get hurt. You can probably already see the problem with this. Actually, there are two problems. The first one is that a weak link in this chain can lead to massive failure. If this person is not at home when their neighbor calls, then an entire chunk of the town will never find out about the ball. The second problem is the problem associated with the game telephone. You know, the game where you whisper something into someone's ear and then they pass it around in a circle and you see how the message is changed by the time it gets back to the other person. Well, that's a problem in this town as well. Someone gets the time wrong or the day wrong accidentally, and a whole chunk of the town is going to have misinformation about the ball. And that's maybe even worse than not getting the information to begin with. This becomes a big enough problem that the most clever woman in town, that is Elizabeth Bennet, she comes up with a solution. And her solution is basically just a twist on the clergyman's calling tree. She starts what she calls the Gossip Notebook Society, and everybody in the society keeps a notebook on hand for these purposes. And instead of passing on these messages verbally, they copy them word for word from their neighbor's notebook when they call. It's easy to see how this would get around the telephone game problem. The second innovation that Miss Bennet comes up with is that she displaces the hierarchical calling tree that the clergyman came up with one that looks more like this. With Elizabeth Bennet's way of doing things, everyone in town calls on 5 neighbors. So it's actually a little bit less efficient to do Elizabeth Bennet's way compared to the clergyman's way. Now everybody calls on 5 people. So it's a little bit less efficient compared to the clergyman's way of doing things where a bunch of people didn't have to make any calls. With the clergyman's calling tree, a good chunk of the town never had to leave their home to visit anybody. But Elizabeth Bennet's way is more foolproof. Nobody gets left out, nobody gets misinformation. Now, in practice, if we're doing Elizabeth Bennet's method, some people are going to show up at their neighbor's house only to find that their neighbor already received the message. They'll compare their notebooks side by side and they'll be identical. So there's trade-offs both ways, but even with the downsides, Elizabeth Bennet's mechanism is better. Now you may notice that we have a distributed ledger under Elizabeth Bennet's system. Everybody in town has an independent and virtually identical copy of the same information in their notebook. And that is exactly what a distributed ledger is. This is basically a blockchain. This system with everybody having their own copy on their own notebook, that's a blockchain, except instead of the notebooks being on paper, they're on people's computers. And also blockchain has a few other features to help with immutability and consensus. One nice thing about distributed ledgers like this is once information starts to work its way through this system, it's almost impossible to stop it. Now that Miss Bennet has invented this Gossip Notebook Society, you can imagine how the workers trying to unionize might want to use this, right? They can use it to get the word out about the timing of their union meetings. If you've read the 5th Harry Potter book, this is almost like this secret coin that they use to organize Dumbledore's army meetings behind Umbridge's back. And the clergyman's calling tree system would never work for organizing unions because the owners of the factory would come together and make threats against the clergyman if he were to use that system for the unions. But with Elizabeth Bennet's system, nobody knows who proposed the original message, so the owners of the factories don't know who to threaten and they don't know who to punish if this kind of word gets out. So the union can happen and it's a happy ending. Why is a system like this so important? Well, we live in an information age, so whoever controls the flow of information has a lot of power. So there are large incentives to infiltrate centralized sources of information. But people in society value having a central source of truth. So there is this tension between people's desire for that central truth and the power abuses that happen when one group controls that central truth. And blockchain or distributed ledger systems like I've just described, they resolve that tension. Now the Gossip Notebook Society that I just described, that's a technology. According to the Economist's definition of technology, technology is the purposeful application of information, design, production, and utilization of goods and services, and in the organization of human activities. So for us economists, things like new management techniques and new forms of government and new banking systems, those are all technologies. So this gossip notebook society, this distributed ledger, this blockchain, this is a technology. And like all technologies, it can be used for good or it can be used for evil. And that includes both intentional and unintentional evils. I'll do another video on the idea of a distributed bully, like a cyber bully vamped up. I'll let you ponder that. In our Austenville example, you might imagine false rumors spreading on this gossip notebook society because writing something down in a notebook doesn't make it true. And this gets at something that we need to explore more deeply with blockchains. And that's the idea that we need a way of validating truth on a blockchain. And I'll do a video talking about that. With cryptocurrencies, we already have a mechanical way of validating truth because it's pretty similar to validating 2 + 2 = 4, but that won't be true with all types of information on a blockchain. But those are just some things to whet your appetite. I hope this video has given you a vision of what a distributed ledger is.